Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. My name is Alejandra Chamberlain, and I'm one of the 3 county leads for the Homeless Technical Assistance Center, also known as HTAC. Today, we are presenting Supporting Unaccompanied Youth, and we are joined by Kayla Antís and Margaret Olmos with the National Center for Youth Law, Suzanne Terry with San Diego County Office of Education, Tori Portel with Bay Area Legal Aid. Next slide, please. Some logistics before we get started. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our HTAC website. All attendees are muted. Attendees may turn on or disable closed captioning, and please use the Q&A to submit questions which can be submitted at any time. If you have any questions, of course, the Q&A, we will be ensuring that we're reading them and answering questions as we go. And resources that will be shared after the webinar to all attendees who have registered. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the National Center for Youth Law.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining today. We are so excited to be here with you to discuss our topic of supporting the education of unaccompanied youth, and we will jump right in. So this is a brief look at our agenda. We're going to define the population and commonly used terms. We are going to do a review of mandated reporting. We're going to get into the rights of our unaccompanied youth, as well as our caregiver affidavits and special education. So jumping into some definitions and terms to get us grounded in who we're talking about and terms that maybe you are hearing for the first time. We always like to start with our McKinney-Vento definition, which really centers around individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. Of course, this includes our children and young people who are sharing housing of other persons due to loss of housing or economic hardship. Of course, our families who are living in hotels, motels, shelters, transitional living programs, any kind of car or park or something that's not designed typically for humans to sleep in, any substandard housing, and all of that good stuff. It's all here in our definition as well. I do want to jump into what unaccompanied means. For a youth to qualify as unaccompanied under the McKinney-Vento Act, they must do two things. One, meet the definition of homelessness under the McKinney-Vento Act, which we just reviewed, and then 2, not be in the physical custody of their parent or guardian. And physical custody refers to where a child or youth is where a child or youth is physically living. A child or young person who is not living with their parent or guardian is likely not in the physical custody of that parent or guardian, and then is considered an unaccompanied youth. For this presentation, moving forward, I do want to keep the definition in mind that we will be talking about unaccompanied youth who qualify both under McKinney-Vento and that unaccompanied youth. So that term moving forward, if we say unaccompanied youth, we are going to be referring to both McKinney-Vento and unaccompanied. Some other definitions and terms that we'll get into, an education rights holder, or ERH, which is the parent or guardian or other person holding the right to make educational decisions for this young person. A caregiver affidavit, which is a caregiver's authorization affidavit, which allows caregivers to enroll a child in school. And if the caregiver is a relative, this does allow them to consent to medical care on behalf of the child. And California law says exactly what should be in this form and who can use it. And we will get further into this as well. Surrogate parents, a surrogate parent must be a person appointed by the LEA to represent a student, whether the student does not have parental representation and has been referred for or is currently being served in special education. Custody orders, a custody order says who a child will live with and who should be making decisions about healthcare, education, and other important decisions. Again, this is a court order, and there are various reasons why these are in place for our young people. And then a guardian, who is a person who isn't the parent, but has a court order giving them legal custody of that child. I am now going to pass it over to Susie Terry to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I was in the middle of typing an answer to a question. So I'm going to cancel it and somebody else will go in and get that answer for you. Sorry. I thought I could type quicker. Anyway, good morning. Thank you all for being here. I think it's important when we talk about supporting unaccompanied homeless youth to just have a little bit of a foundation around who they are. So I'm going to talk a little bit here about the causes of youth homelessness. If you go to a McKinney-Vento 101 training, you probably hear a little bit about the causes of family homelessness. And youth tend to become homeless oftentimes for different reasons than families become homeless. So oftentimes young people are experiencing homelessness because they've left situations around abuse or neglect, that home situations that maybe should have come to the attention of child welfare services but didn't, and have just become untenable for the youth to stay. Acute family conflict is also another really big reason why young people can become homeless on their own. The two most common reasons for a young person to get kicked out of their home are family conflict around LGBTQ status and family conflict around pregnancy. So other family conflicts are also common causes for youth to either be asked to leave their home or to leave on their own because the situation has become too difficult for them to manage. Another reason why youth sometimes become homeless on their own are economic challenges for the whole family. So sometimes we will see youth experiencing homelessness who have been homeless with their family and without. Oftentimes, as a youth gets older, they feel more pressure to not be an additional burden on that already struggling family. And so they will feel the need to go out on their own and maybe try to find their own place to stay. This sort of goes hand in hand with the last bullet, which is shelter policies. This can really apply to shelter policies or families who are doubled up. Sometimes there are situations where even in a doubled up home where there is a family willing to take you in, they may not have room for everyone in the family. And so sometimes older children will want their younger siblings and their mom to have a place to stay. So they'll choose to go and maybe try to find their own place to stay. And so those are some of the reasons that we see for students to become unhoused and on their own. Next slide. So this slide is really in direct response to questions that I get from LEAs sometimes about the difference between an unaccompanied homeless youth and a runaway. A lot of times I will get questions about the difference, or, maybe we understand the basics around unaccompanied homeless youth under McKinney-Vento, but then an LEA will ask me like, well, what about a runaway? So I just like to clarify that a student can be an unaccompanied homeless youth regardless of whether or not they were forced from their home or ran away or were in one of those family situations that I mentioned on the previous slide. It's really important, and the Department of Education has clarified that McKinney-Vento determinations for unaccompanied students really should be made on whether or not they meet the definition. So with regard to their current nighttime residence rather than why. So a lot of times I know LEAs will call me because they're getting all of this extra information. When you have an unaccompanied homeless student at school, sometimes there's all kinds of people with information about like, well, she really just wants to go live with her boyfriend's family, or this is going on, or that's going on. And I think it's really important to try to tune all of that out when you're making a determination and focus specifically on whether or not they meet the definition. All of that other information is really irrelevant to whether or not they qualify under McKinney-Vento. And oftentimes, what caused a student to be separated from their family is not information that we're ever going to truly know the entire story. So I always advise my LEAs to assume that there's information they don't have about the student situation, that there's always more to the story, and it might not be information that a student is going to be like readily willing to disclose due to the situation being really sensitive and private in nature. So just a note on that. Next slide. So I always say that I could fill 10 slides with this information, but due to time constraints, I always have to whittle it down to one slide. It's important to understand that these situations that youth find themselves in, put them in really precarious situations often, and they have a profound impact on their mental and physical health. So it's important to know that unaccompanied youth have unique educational barriers and unique challenges. They have higher than average rates of mental health and substance abuse, criminal victimization, criminal activity related to survival. So there are a lot of survival related behaviors that that students will engage in out of desperation, and that oftentimes can lead to exchanging sex or labor for a place to stay, or falling victim to hosts like couch surfing hosts that are actually unscrupulous and taking advantage of them, which then also can lead to higher rates of pregnancy and sexually transmitted disease. But again, I could have filled 10 more slides with just this type of information. There's so much information out there about the impacts of homelessness on youth. I just think it's really important to understand they have very unique traumatic experiences that will be important for your understanding when we're going to support them and try to support their education. Next slide. So obviously, all of those unique traumatic experiences that unaccompanied youth have are going to create barriers for them at school. And this is another slide where I could fill at least 3 or 4 more slides about the barriers that are created for homeless students. You can see a lot of examples on the slide. I think it's important to say that there is no definitive list of what is a barrier for an unaccompanied homeless student, or really a McKinney-Vento family. Barriers can be very unique to the specific situation. And so it's important to always keep an open mind and open communication around what's going on with your students and what barriers you might not have thought about or been aware of. But you can see a lot of examples on the slide around lack of school stability, being hungry, tired, stressed. The impacts of trauma have a lot to do with barriers that our students face, as well as just not having a parent or guardian to help them understand all of the things that they have to get done for school, how to get their needs met, and just not having consistent access to laundry facilities. A lot of times that's a huge barrier for unaccompanied homeless students. They don't want to keep coming to school if they can't bathe and wash their clothes. And again, these are a few examples of the number of things that that our students face that are barriers for them accessing school. Next slide. And so this slide is really a summary of what we heard recently from an unaccompanied homeless youth at a conference. And we wanted to sort of summarize it into a slide to share it with all of you, since we can't have a young person with lived experience here with us today. Wanted to share some of the tips that they shared with us. And so if you look at the slide, you'll see a lot of times the student shared, like, saying, "I'm sorry, this must be really hard." Types of comments too often can be sort of discouraging and off-putting for a young person. They really just need support, and not necessarily feeling like they're getting a lot of pity or sympathy put upon them by adults, because I think it forces them into a position of having to say, like, it's okay, when really it might not be. Not asking them too many questions up front. Young people will share with you at their own pace, and really based on their own decisions. And that will have a lot to do with the relationship that you have with them and how much trust you're able to build. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there are tons of situations where you may not ever have the full story, and that's okay. It's their story, and they can share it if they feel like it, but some students may never give you very much information at all. They also don't want to be overloaded with information right off the bat. So here's a list of like 18 places you can call to try to get services is too much for an unaccompanied student, especially when you think about some of the impacts on the last couple of slides. Like, they're tired, they're stressed, they're probably experiencing a lot of anxiety, and then giving them a ton of things to do to get help can just be too much. So that sort of goes along with avoiding giving hard deadlines. A lot of times when I talk to my LEAs, I try to remind them, like, to really focus on what's truly important in this situation. You know, is getting the assignment back on such and such a day, or getting this information back on such day, really what's truly important, or getting the information, getting the youth through the assignment or through the information. Also, the student that we heard from mentioned doing the work for them, making the calls and facilitating warm connections to resources, which I think is really good advice and is supported in the McKinney-Vento legislation about liaisons, you know, working to help youth and families get to the services they need, find them, make the call, and then help them build their own support system, help young people find someplace, places and spaces for themselves where they can build their support system. And then trying to be their point person, make sure they know, like, they can come back to you for information, to touch base, that you're going to check in with them, that you're going to follow up, so that you become their point person when they have a question, they don't know who to ask. A lot of students will just avoid asking certain questions because they don't have the answer, and they don't feel like asking, or they don't know who to ask, or they may not know how to ask. So the more that you're their person, the easier it'll be for them to explain to you when they're not understanding something that's going on. Next slide. And this is my last slide that I'm going to talk about in this section. And I just have to say, I never do a training where I don't include this slide and talk about this slide. This is information from the Chapin Hall research that came out at the very end of 2017. And one of the things that's important to me about this slide is to make sure that every time I talk to people, I'm sharing with them that lack of a high school diploma or equivalent is the single greatest risk factor for future homelessness. So the importance of what you all do, everyone who's listening to this webinar today, plays such an important role in preventing future homelessness for students just by helping them get to graduation or get to an equivalent. And then if you look at the slide, you will see there's a lot of intersectionality among these risk factors, and there are students that fall into more than one of these categories, especially our unaccompanied homeless youth who, as I mentioned earlier, are likely to be in the LGBTQ population or are likely to be unmarried, pregnant, or parenting youth who also have extremely high risk factors. And so compound that with a student who maybe doesn't make it to graduation and the risk factors get really high. So, and because of this slide and because of this information, I know there's always also a big focus on graduation, as there should be, but I just want to say that also like helping students find post-secondary pathways will make it even that much more likely that they'll have economic security going forward. The poverty rate for a college graduate is about a third of the poverty rate for a high school graduate. So not just getting them to graduation, but getting them to really dream and think about what they want to do and where they want to go, and helping them get there will really do a lot to help prevent the future homelessness for our youth. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to National Center for Youth Law.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to jump in quickly into mandated reporting and the definition just to get us grounded as questions may come up when we're working with unaccompanied youth. What is reportable? What is not? So some examples and the definition of child abuse and child neglect can be any of the following, whether that's physical injury inflicted on a child by another person other than by accidental means, the sexual abuse, assault, or exploitation of a child, the neglect, treatment, or maltreatment of a child by a person responsible for the child's welfare under circumstances indicating harm or threatened harm to a child's health or welfare. This is whether the harm or threat is from acts of omission on the part of the person, the responsible person, and the willful harming or endangerment of the person or health of a child, any cruel or inhumane corporal punishment, or any injury resulting in a traumatic condition. I do want to just remind us all that as school and district employees, administrators, or athletic coaches, we are all qualified as mandated reporters of child abuse and neglect, and that can be found in California penal codes. One does not have to be physically present or witness the abuse to identify suspected cases of abuse or even have definite proof, remembering that reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect happening is more than enough to report. And we do have an embedded link for additional information, as this PowerPoint and additional resources will be sent out at the end of this presentation. And LEA liaisons can inform youth and families that a child's homelessness or status as an unaccompanied youth is not enough by itself to report child abuse or neglect. And that's really big for our families who are already dealing with so much in their life and are in very scary situations sometimes. So reminding them that their homelessness or unaccompanied status alone is not enough to report them to CPS. Now we're going to jump into some additional rights. So of course, our unaccompanied youth who are also identified as McKinney-Vento have access to all the McKinney-Vento rights, including that immediate enrollment, school of origin, AB 1806, transportation, free lunch program, and full and equal access and involvement in school. They also have some additional rights as well that extend to our youth who are unaccompanied. And so students who are 14 years or older and meet the definition of homelessness and unaccompanied can access their own school records. And they may file FAFSA as an independent, meaning they do not need their parents' tax information or any parental information when applying for FAFSA. And this is in part removing barriers, especially thinking about our unaccompanied youth who are not in the physical custody of their parents or legal guardians, might not have access to this information. So now we want to hear from you. We will be dropping a Jamboard link. We have two actually that are the exact same, just to help with our capacity issues. I know last time we used a Jamboard link, not everyone was able to get on. So we have two that are the exact same. And we want to hear from you. What challenges are you experiencing when it comes to supporting this population of unaccompanied youth? We are working to get that Jamboard link to you all.
Forgive us as there is a little bit of technical difficulties. Hold on.
I see in the Q&A, where is the chat? We are actively working to open up the chat, as that is not currently available. So don't worry if you don't see it.
We are having that updated. Give us a quick second. Thank you for your patience. It wouldn't be a Zoom world if we didn't have technical difficulties.
Kayla, you also have a raised hand. I don't know if that's something.
Yeah, I actually
We can-
can't see that. So yes, who is raising their hand?
While you get to that, I'm going to use the where is the chat to put the link of the Jamboree into that particular question as a response until we figure out this issue that we're having with the chat.
So the raised hand is if you look in participants and you click on attendees, I don't think because I'm not the host, I have the ability to allow the raised hand to unmute.
I do. All right. I think we have Kevin on our screen with our raised hand. If you would like to unmute and ask your question or comment.
Must have hit that on accident. Sorry.
No problem.
I love it.
And I do want to acknowledge that I have placed the first Jamboree link in the response to the individual who asked about the chat. So if you go to the answers, that should take you to the first Jamboree. You should be able to click on it. And then I will add the second one. Give me a quick second.
Alejandra, where did you put the link?
Alejandra, you are muted, but it is under the Q&A. If you
Thank
go
you.
under answered questions all the way
Yes.
at the bottom, there is a question about where is the chat, and the Jamboard links are located there.
Yes,
Okay.
I am troubleshooting this non-chat existing issue we're having. So again, if you go to Q&A and you click at the top where it says, it indicates the answers. There is a question where it says, where is the chat? All the way at the bottom, you will see 2 links. The first one is to the first Jamboree, and the second one is to the second one, so that everyone can have an opportunity to respond. And we apologize. Thank you.
Our IT team is in charge of the settings, and he is supposed to come in and turn it on soon.
But folks have joined the Jamboard, and that's wonderful.
All right, I am going to hopefully be still sharing my screen. Can we see the Jamboard on my screen? Yes, awesome. Okay, so I am going to have this up and we can call out different post-its or notes that participants are adding, and I will bounce back and forth and try to call out as many of these as I can. So not sure things work well, but they seem to be working. Okay, collaborating with the counselors and the liaisons. You know, I do realize, here we go. Okay, so we are on challenges and what's working well. So let's focus right now on the challenges that we're experiencing, and we will jump into what's working well later. So some challenges that you all are experiencing are resources and funds. Yes, I see that twice. That is definitely something I think a lot of us are experiencing. Being able to get an education rights holder to sign off on any kind of educational decision making. For that one, I would be curious, is it identifying an education rights holder or working with them to have them sign off on things, and definitely wanting to break that down a little bit more. English language barriers and placement, guardianship status, not knowing the exact amount of money available to support these families, your school's budget, of course, college application support, transportation, attendance and chronic absenteeism. Absolutely. I'm going to toggle over to our second Jamboard. Keeping the students motivated, absolutely. Identification, yes, and this is a very specific population, because not only are they McKinney-Vento, but they are also unaccompanied, and our unaccompanied youth in general can be one of the hardest populations to identify. You know, as that does tend to fold in with that chronic absenteeism and lack of transportation and connection to school are all things that can unfortunately be hard for these young people. And so identifying them comes along with that. Work permits, who should and can sign, absolutely. Basic communication, oftentimes there's no phone service and unstable Wi-Fi, absolutely. And for this, we also want to think about unstable Wi-Fi and how that impacts their ability to be successful in school, and especially do homework in their home or wherever they are living. And so how can schools support stable Wi-Fi? Does your district have a resource center or hotspots that are available to be given out to young people, and how you are prioritizing who gets hotspots, as sometimes there are only limited numbers of those per site. Helping them access resources without parental consent. We will jump into some of that health stuff at the end of this webinar, just so that we know that there are rights there for that. Identifying students in a timely manner. Yes, identification is one of the most difficult and most important parts of what we do. If we don't know who we're serving, we definitely can't serve them very as well as we know we could if we did know who they were. So identification is a huge one. And we did do a webinar on identification, and it sounds like we might be redoing that webinar, just a re-up on that. So definitely keep an eye out for identification, as that is a huge topic. Housing and or shelters, yes. I know in Monterey County, where I am located, we don't have any shelters that will accept youth under the age of 18. So it's a huge barrier for our unaccompanied minors specifically. And I know that we are not alone in that struggle. Definitely keep posting on this Jamboard. We will organize them and send them out at the end with all of the additional resources in the PowerPoint. So definitely keep posting. And we are going to jump back into our slideshow. So now I want to shift and talk a little bit about caregiver affidavits. I know we gave the definitions, but there's so much more to each of these aspects than just their definition. So a caregiver affidavit will allow you to enroll the child in school. If you are a relative, you can consent to medical care on behalf of the child. And if you are a non-relative, you may consent to school-related medical care only. When I first read that, my first question is, what is school-related medical care? I had never quite heard that term before. So we wanted to make sure to touch upon that too. And school-related medical care is medical care that is required for a child to enroll in school or fully participate in school. And your state and local governments set these requirements, but some examples can include immunizations, physical exams, and medical examinations conducted in schools, such as the eye testing that can be done and the scoliosis testing that's sometimes done in schools. Does a caregiver affidavit affect the custody rights of a parent? And the answer to that is no. A caregiver's affidavit does not affect the rights of the child's parent, and the parent still has custody and control of the child, even though they are not physically living with that parent or legal guardian. A caregiver's affidavit does not give you legal custody of the child. So this does not make you a legal guardian. And if you need to get legal custody or become a legal guardian of a child, consider seeking guardianship in state probate court. And I can't stress enough, we do have additional resources that will be sent out, including examples of what a caregiver affidavit can look like in the resources at the end of this PowerPoint. So now we're going to jump into surrogate parents. A surrogate parent is different from a caregiver with a signed affidavit. And who can be a surrogate parent? So a surrogate parent must be a person who is appointed by that LEA to represent a student, whether whenever the student does not have a parental representation and has been referred for or is currently being served in special education. So surrogate parents are tied to special education. And the LEA shall give first preference to a relative caregiver, foster parent, or court-appointed special advocate. Surrogate parents must meet the following requirements. They shall not be an employee of a public or private agency involved in the education or care of the child. For our students who are experiencing homelessness or who are unaccompanied, the surrogate parent may be an employee of an agency if needed. And I will get into what that can look like a little bit later. The surrogate shall have no interest that conflicts with the interests of the child that he or she represents. And the surrogate shall have knowledge and skills that ensure adequate representation of the child. So we want to make sure that whoever is identified as a surrogate parent knows some of the ins and outs of the special education system, what an IEP is, what a 504 is, what the child's needs are, and know how to advocate for that child. As I mentioned, our unaccompanied youth and McKinney-Vento have a little bit differences when it comes to surrogate parents. So for our unaccompanied youth, a temporary surrogate parent may be appointed until a surrogate parent can be appointed who meets all of the requirements. And this is really for removing barriers for these young people so that their access to special education is not delayed because a surrogate parent can't be appointed. Temporary surrogate parents may include staff of emergency shelters, transitional shelters, independent living programs, street outreach programs, etc. But they must be free of any personal or professional conflicts of interest with the child and the child's interests, and possess knowledge and skills that ensure adequate representation of that child. So this is that stipulation to that requirement number 1, where they shall not be employee of a public or private agency involved in the child's care. But a temporary surrogate parent may be a public or private agency employee. So now we're going to jump into the specifics of surrogate parents within special education. And so the role of a surrogate parent here, a surrogate parent has all the same rights as a parent as it relates to special education and education services. A surrogate parent can represent a student through the SPED process, which includes identification, assessment, instructional planning and development, educational placement, and reviewing and revising the IEP. And I do want to note here that a person acting as a caregiver for a young person may also flag that this young person might need special education and put in a request for an assessment. And so the surrogate parent does have rights, and they include access to educational records that are relevant to any of the decisions being made regarding the educational program of this child. We want to make sure that they have full access to, transcripts and their history, so that this person can advocate on behalf of the child in the way that this child needs, and be aware of what their educational needs might be. When a student is being considered for suspension or expulsion, and there is a dispute over the identification, assessment, or placement of the student, the surrogate parent is entitled to participate as the parent in all phases of the proceedings. So we're going to continue to talk about more of this surrogate parents, special education, and their role. The surrogate parent may represent the child until any of the following circumstances are determined. If the child is no longer in need of special education, as I had mentioned, surrogate parents are tied to special education. So if there is no longer a special education need, then the surrogate parent no longer has their rights. If the minor reaches the age of 18, they are now allowed to represent themselves, unless the child chooses to not make educational decisions for him, her, or themselves, or is deemed by a court to be incompetent. If another responsible adult is appointed to make educational decisions for the minor, then they would transfer their surrogate parent rights over to that person. And the right of the parent or guardian to make educational decisions for the minor is fully restored. So if the legal guardian or parent is given their full education rights back, the surrogate parent is no longer needed in that case. So now I'm going to pass it back to Susie, and we're going to talk a little bit about navigating the gray area, as much of this topic is a gray area and very specific to the needs of individual cases.
Thank you, Kayla. And I just want to say really quick before I start, I did see a bunch of questions about some of these gray areas. So I hope I'm going to cover it when I talk about this. But one of the things that that I also want to mention about some of the questions I was trying to help answer, there's a lot of questions related to immigrant, refugee youth, and unaccompanied youth. And I just want to, since this isn't a training specific to that, although Denise can correct me if I'm wrong, I do think we have one coming up, so look for that. There's also a resource on the HETAC website, which is HETAC, HETAC.org. And there is a tip sheet on refugees and immigrants that you may find helpful with some of those questions. But again, what I always say is it's a case-by-case basis. If those families qualify, you just got to go back to the definition and make your determinations at the end of the day. But I saw a bunch of immigrant questions, so I just wanted to make that note on that. So some of the gray areas, these next two slides are really just based on questions, again, that have come up a lot in my county that I've had to try to figure out answers to. So one of them has to do with parental involvement. So, and especially I saw this question coming up in relation to surrogate parents and special education and FAFSA. So one thing to note is that even if a student is an unaccompanied homeless youth and if they're living with a caregiver, whether or not the caregiver signed a caregiver affidavit at school, if the parents are MIA, an individual acting as a parent in the absence of a parent or guardian meets the definition of parent in FERPA. So you can treat a caregiver in the manner in which you would treat a parent when it comes to educational rights, educational records, because as long as the parents are not around, if there is a parent around and they're attempting to exercise their FERPA rights, then their rights will always trump anybody else's. So FERPA rights will always stay with the parents, even if they're MIA, but you can work with a caregiver if you can't find a parent. And I just want to note that includes the signing of an IEP. So if you don't have a parent, can't find a parent, and you are looking, it's looking like you're going to have to assign a surrogate. If there is a caregiver that is, likely has signed a caregiver affidavit, or even if they haven't, but they're involved, they're trying to care for the student, you can have them sign the IEP in the parent's place. And one other thing on surrogates that I just want to add is if you do have to assign a surrogate for a student, talk to the student and find out if there's an adult in their life who might be willing to at least help them through the special education process. Like they may be able to identify somebody that would make a good surrogate for them. And so that's always a good strategy as well when you can't find a surrogate. So a little bit more on FERPA rights, they do revert to the student when they turn 18. So oftentimes when I get calls about this from folks in my district about a FERPA issue and an unaccompanied student, the first question I always ask is, are they 18? By the way, because that makes it a lot easier. But FERPA also allows schools to have students have access to their educational records and provide consent for some disclosures, as long as, again, they're not superseding the rights of the parents and the student has been deemed responsible enough. So that being said, where FERPA is involved, McKinney-Vento rights remain, and there are some McKinney-Vento rights that are given directly to an unaccompanied youth that parents, even if they're around, they're active, they're exercising their FERPA rights, they cannot take school choice from an unaccompanied youth because that's given directly to the student in McKinney-Vento. So, and what I mean by that is a student has a choice if they move to remain in their school of origin or to attend the school near the area where they're spending their nights, and that decision does not get taken away from the unaccompanied youth. The legislation says specifically that the district will give priority to the wishes of the unaccompanied youth. And so how that plays out sometimes, and some of you may be familiar with this, is a parent whose student is not living with them anymore, but there is all kinds of family conflict. I know a lot of districts deal with a lot of family drama that gets played out at school because of this conflict. A parent can't call the school and disenroll a student who doesn't live with them and has been determined to be an unaccompanied homeless youth. That's where that McKinney-Vento right sort of comes into play. So they can't say well, I don't want my student going to this school anymore because of whatever's going on. That choice remains with the unaccompanied youth. Next slide. The other thing that comes up a lot with unaccompanied homeless youth is questions about runaways and parents, and when do we call the parents and when do we not call the parents. So I just want to start by saying schools do not have a duty to find an unaccompanied homeless youth's parents or guardians. At the end of the day, the school's duty is to educate, right? So it's our main priority is to make sure that we're getting them enrolled in class, taking care of their educational needs above all else. That being said, a lot of times, even though I say there's no duty for schools to find a parent, you want your decision-making to really follow the best interest of the student. So is the student trying to find their parent or guardian? And is that something that they want help with? If the student does not want contact with a parent or guardian and they don't want the school to tell the parents where they are, it's important for you to understand and then to help a student understand that because parents retain their FERPA rights, they do have a right to certain information contained in the student's record, and that can include what they've listed as their address. And so if you're supporting a student, you want to make sure that they know that you're talking to the student about the fact that like your priority is going to be what's best for them. And so if it comes up that you're required, that their parent is asking, that you would have to share that information with them. Now, a lot of students also can be made aware of the fact that they are not required to share their address with you. They can use the school's address for things. If they feel unsafe and they don't want to share their address, they do have that right. And sometimes that's a good workaround in one of these situations. The best thing to consider is if the student shares with you, it's a safety issue, and they're willing to share with you why. If it's something that requires a call to child welfare services or law enforcement, once you've done that, if a parent comes to school asking about where their student is living, and you've already contacted child welfare, then you can refer them to that agency to deal with it. That this has been referred to child welfare, so you have to contact them. And that sort of takes the school out of it. Because again, like we want to stay in our lane most of the time where we're more comfortable and focus on education and what we need to do to get a student educated. So in terms of missing persons reports, if you know a student has a missing persons report, maybe the police have called you already to try to see if the student is coming to school. And at that point in time, the student maybe hadn't enrolled with you yet. So you know there's a missing persons report, then you should contact the police when the student does show up to let them know that they are attending school. So we can't hide a student from their parents necessarily, but if there is no missing persons report that you're aware of, you are also not required. You have no obligation to reach out to the police and find out and let them know that a student is at school. Again, it's really goes back to trying to make sure that whoever at your school has a relationship with the student is talking to the student and making them aware of what the school does and does not have to do so that they can make decisions accordingly and you can help them stay safe. Around calling the police, this comes up with my districts a lot. I have a lot of district liaisons that will say to me like, Susie, if my kids find out that I'm contacting law enforcement about them, I will never see them again. And the risk to that is that at least, like, if you go back to the slide I shared earlier about all of the risks and impacts of being an unaccompanied homeless youth, at least when we have them engaged and coming to school, we know where they are and that they're safe for 6 hours every day. We know they're getting fed. We know they're not being taken advantage of somewhere. So it really, aside from the graduation and all of that, it's so important to try to keep these kids coming to school. Relationships do that, supports, resources do that. But so you have this conflicting obligation that involving law enforcement may actually be creating a barrier for your students. You may be creating a barrier as a violation of McKinney-Vento because you're calling the police as a barrier to retention. So the best way to sort of navigate that, I don't actually have a definitive answer to that conflict, but I want to acknowledge that it exists because it comes up in a lot of situations. Ideally, you would be talking to the police about the situation, explaining to them that this child's in school, that the school's required to keep the student enrolled, regardless of what's going on with the parents. The police can then contact the parents and try to determine what's going to be best for that student. But you always want to have someone who has a relationship with the student, having conversations with them and helping navigate them through this and find the best answers. It's a really tough one with when family conflict is getting played out at school. So hopefully that gives you some greater understanding of how to navigate that situation. And then I'm going to turn it back over to Kayla for some more scenarios.
Awesome. Yeah, so these scenarios are still going to be us working through and navigating this very, very gray area. And so scenario one is about Sam, who is a 16-year-old sophomore in high school. He has been identified as both McKinney-Vento and unaccompanied. Sam is currently couch surfing with friends and extended family. And Sam's science class will be going on a field trip that requires a permission slip to be signed. Who signed Sam's permission slip? Since we don't have our chat function fully functioning, I am going to jump into our next slide, which does discuss the scenario and its answer. So first, we're going to want to start by checking with your district policies. And in many cases, the following are sufficient. Caregivers with a signed affidavit can typically sign permission slips, surrogate parents that have been identified through the special education process. And of course, if Sam was 18 or older, he would be able to sign for himself. But we know from this scenario, Sam is only 16, so that wouldn't be applicable here. And what do you do if there is no surrogate parent or caregiver with a signed affidavit? Sam should still be eligible to participate in the field trip. Part of his rights as being both McKinney-Vento and unaccompanied is full and equal access to his education, which does include this field trip through his science class. So principals, counselors, social workers, or other staff should reach out to the district liaison to approve and provide permission to allow Sam to participate fully in his academics. Check with your district policies. If you don't know, ask and start there. Start with your district liaison who supports this population, and they should typically be able to provide that permission for you. So our second scenario is with Sarah, and she is a 19-year-old who shows up and wants to enroll at Marina High School. She shares that she is currently living at Safe Passage, a known transitional living program for youth aged 18 to 24, and does not have any contact with her biological parents. Can Sarah enroll at Marina High School, and what factors should be considered? I know this is one we get quite frequently just because Sarah is over the age of 18. So how do we handle this? If there is involvement in special education, LEAs are required to provide special education services until the age of 22, or when the student receives a high school diploma, whichever one comes first. So we want to look and consider, is Sarah involved in special education? Does she have an IEP? Are there any of those factors present in her case? We want to determine the credits completed and or the number of years of high school that she has already completed. Students have the right to remain in high school for a 5th year under AB 1806 to complete the state or local requirements. And so we want to keep that in mind. She does qualify as McKinney-Vento, so she does have that right to that 5th year under there. So we want to keep in mind how many credits and the number of years of high school completed. Is that 5th year enough to get her to graduation? Would that be sufficient? And then different districts have different options available. Many have educational options programs that Sarah might qualify for, adult school programs that Sarah might qualify for. And if you don't know, again, ask. And of course, when we're looking at these situations, we want to look at the whole student. And if Sarah is 19 and living on her own in a transitional living program, she probably also works a job. And so we want to keep that in mind when we're discussing what's best with Sarah, what's best for her, keeping in mind what her schedule is and what's reasonable for her. And she is 19, and so she can fully be a part of these conversations. And so we want to make sure that her voice is heard. So we are going to jump into another Jamboard. They are the exact same links as before that are going to be in the Q&A still under answered questions. So please find your way back to those. And what we want to hear now is what has worked well and what do you want to continue doing? And I am going to jump from the slideshow over to our Jamboards. And why am I not seeing what is working well and what do you want to continue doing? I am going to copy and paste this onto the other one, because I don't see that here. Perfect. Does anyone have any trouble having any trouble finding the Jamboard links again? They should be under Q&A. So if you go under your Q&A and toggle over to answered questions, and they are going to be under where is the chat, and those two links should be found located right there. I see a couple people are now starting to pop on. So I'd love to hear what has worked well that you want to continue doing. I'm going to make this the same. And maybe if you aren't sure what is currently working well, what from today do you want to take and start trying to do that you think might work well for your population? I always like to add that each district and each school population is different. And so the needs of these young people are going to be different. And so you should always be taking the resources and the information from these trainings and webinars and taking it back and personalizing it to fit your district and population. What works for one district isn't going to necessarily work for another. And even within districts, our different schools are very different, especially when you're looking at elementary school to middle school and high school. The age range is very it makes things different. We need to be developmentally appropriate when we're addressing our unaccompanied youth. And so keep all of that in mind when you're thinking about what is working well and what you want to continue doing or what you want to start doing. Having homeless liaisons at each school site, absolutely. If your district has the ability and funding to do that, it is absolutely incredible. As we know, COVID has increase the number of McKinney-Vento families and unaccompanied youth. And so having liaisons at each school site or multiple within a district to serve more youth is always great. Working with community agencies to provide supports to eligible students, absolutely. It really does take a village to raise a child, and schools are, as Susie talked about, really overseeing their educational needs. And so if we can partner with community-based organizations to bring in additional resources, you're only going to strengthen that connection between the family or the young person and their school. Especially with our unaccompanied youth, school might be the only true structure they really have. And so if we can bring additional resources to them there and reduce those barriers, that's great. Collaborating with other agencies, absolutely. Dedicated counselors for supporting McKinney-Vento and unaccompanied youth for college and career support, absolutely. FAFSA is really hard to navigate, even with parents, but without parents. And for our unaccompanied youth, having support to navigate filling that application out, also looking through colleges and career exploration and what do you want to do, and having a person that you can talk through all of that with only increases the likelihood that they will be connected to post-secondary education. And if post-secondary isn't for them, and that's not for everybody, what about training programs and CTE courses, or really getting them set up for success? And information that unaccompanied youth might need after graduation is, how do you get an ID? And there are waivers for the fees to get an ID. How do you locate your social security card if that's applicable to you? How do you write a resume? All of these resources that we want our young people to be equipped with to be successful when they graduate from high school. What else is on here? Working together with districts and liaisons, absolutely. Meeting with district liaisons to bridge gaps in resources and streamline services. Yes. And I will also throw out, taking what's working well somewhere else and bringing it to you, and again, adapting it to your population is great. Don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. If something's already working, use it. Working as a team with our counselors, school psych, and enrollment personnel, absolutely. During our identification webinar, we talked about position-specific training for these populations because our school enrollment personnel plays a very unique role, just as our psychs and counselors do, and they might have different needs in their knowledge base. Our counselors and psychs were really going to want to be very familiar with AB 1806, which is that reduced credits, partial credits, and fifth year piece that our students are eligible for. And our enrollment personnel are really going to need to be more knowledgeable on identification and a housing questionnaire. Consulting with LACO, I'm glad that's been helpful for you and that you're going to continue doing it. Absolutely. Staff and student presentations around supporting this population. Yes. Asking questions to the district, making sure that youth are able are at the table to make decisions, and not making the decisions without them. Absolutely, especially with this unaccompanied youth population. We want to involve them in their education as much as possible. And remembering and going back to any youth 14 or older does have the right to access their own education records. Of course, when we're talking about this population. And so having them learn how to review their own education records can be really helpful to sit down with a counselor and what is a transcript and how do you read the transcript, instead of just handing over the file and saying, here you go, review it. Let's walk them through and teach them and empower them to be able to review their own records. Help to apply for CalFresh. Absolutely. CalFresh, you do not have to be of a certain age to apply for that, and our unaccompanied youth are definitely eligible for that. I see that on this slide too. Engaging our community and law enforcement to help support our youth. Absolutely. Keeping in mind that, as Susie mentioned, law enforcement can sometimes be a barrier and can sometimes be a help. So we really want to think about what's best for the student and for that specific situation before we involve law enforcement, including if you know the young person's past and if they have a traumatic past with law enforcement, we want to keep in mind what is best for that young person on whether we involve them or not. This is great. Definitely keep adding to this. Again, we will be sending it out. And I am going to toggle back to our PowerPoint.
Kayla?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Can I answer a question really quick, or actually ask you to help me answer a question really quick? Because a few things came up in the chat when I talked about not calling law enforcement, and I don't want to be controversial on Alejandra's webinar. And Denise's, and so I kind of want to see if you or Margaret, like the legal people, will help me with this. So I have a question in the chat, a few of them, but essentially about like, where does it state in the law that we shouldn't call the parent or law enforcement if the liaison needs to access them for safety or try to understand the student's situation? This would mean that we're not following school guidelines. So I'm just going to say what I think about that. But again, I don't want to be controversial. So I'm going to ask, like, if you and Margaret would chime in. But what I mean when I say that is not that you absolutely should not. It's that you should look at the specific issues for that student's situation and figure out what is safe for them and in their best interest. I can tell you, I've worked with unaccompanied homeless youth for many, many years. And I have seen situations go south. One in particular where a student was told, because this is another question that came up about, like, can we drop a student if they're unaccompanied and a missing persons report has been filed? I answered that in the chat, but I have one particular experience where a student was told by someone at the school that they needed to go home if they wanted to continue attending. That decision was based on what the school decided about the reason why the student wasn't at home. That's why I always emphasize it's not about why, because you probably don't know the real reason. So they made a decision based on why they thought the student had left and told her that she had to go home if she wanted to continue to be enrolled in school, and actually sent that student who really did want to be at school, so went home to a very dangerous situation that did not turn out well for that student. So I think about that situation a lot when I'm trying to make these decisions, because I don't want to be that person that and have to like kind of live with the fact that I made the decision to tell that student they had to go home. And so that's, I think, I guess for you guys to understand a little bit better where I'm coming from, that guides a lot of my decision making when I'm talking about these gray area situations. But in terms of schools, like not calling the police or not calling parents, I'm going to ask like Kayla if you or Margaret want to chime in on that, because I also don't want to give out like bad or controversial information.
I really agree with everything that you're saying. For me, it really comes to what is in the best interest of the student. And as school personnel, it is not our job to mandate a young person to go home. That is not within your job description, and not a decision that you need to be making on behalf of the young person or the family. And so it's really looking at what's in the best interest of the student, and asking questions around safety is really important. If this young person does not feel safe to go home, regardless of the reason, that's when you want to involve law enforcement if necessary, and child protective services as well, depending on what the situation is. And especially if, say, legal parents or guardians file a missing persons report that the school is aware of, and then the school does have to call law enforcement in and say, you know, we do have this child. We also want to be making sure that that child is safe to go home, and that there isn't an open CPS report. And a lot of counties are typically, I would say, pretty good at law enforcement cross-checking CPS reports, but there are gaps in every system. And so we do, if we know that there's an open CPS report on a young person, but parents are filing a missing persons report and it gets messy, we want to double check with police officers. If you can say, you know, I know there's an open CPS report, this young person is adamant about not being safe at home, and then law enforcement can then take it from there. And so I think those are the big things that come up for me.
Yes, just to second that, I completely agree with Kayla, and Susie, I completely agree with your take. I have definitely been that person on Friday afternoon calling the police department about a student when there was multiple open CPS reports, and, you know, police saying we weren't aware of it. So I think ensuring that we are really talking to the young person and that they really feel safe, and not assuming that we know that decision without talking to them. I think that should always be foremost in our mind. So completely agree with you. I hope that we are not being too controversial. Alejandra will tell us if we are, though. Thanks, Kayla.
Awesome. Susie, do you have any other additional comments?
No, thank you. There was one other sort of version of that question that had come up in the chat just about keeping them enrolled. And so I just want to also like remind everybody that unaccompanied homeless students are able to enroll themselves in school without a parent, and they have a right to immediate enrollment, which includes participating in classes, attending classes, and fully participating in school activities. So they should not be disenrolled if they are found to be unaccompanied. That would be a violation of McKinney-Vento. That's the only other thing.
Yeah, and keeping in mind that we don't want to punish or put additional barriers in front of our young people just because of their living situation. Not only is that not right, but that is illegal. So we do not want to disenroll young people just because they are unaccompanied. And I understand that being unaccompanied can bring attendance issues and things like that, schools let's be honest, don't like to necessarily have on their record. But that is not a reason to drop a young person. That is more of a reason to reach out and provide additional supports to this young person, and try to re-engage them, as school, like I had mentioned with our unaccompanied youth, might be the only thing that they have that is consistent. And so taking that away from them just because they are unaccompanied or going through hardship can be extremely detrimental to this young person. So going on, that's what we have for today. Margaret and my contact information is on the screen. Do feel free to reach out to us with questions. Susie, I'm not sure if you want to drop your email or contact information maybe in the Q&A, or we can definitely 100% will be including that in all of the communication that goes out afterwards, so that you have full access as participants to reach out to us with additional questions. And I can't stress enough that there is so much gray area when it comes to this topic, and every decision should be based on the best interest of the student and individualized based on their needs. Take the information that you have about this young person, ask additional questions to fill in gaps, include the young person, and think outside of the box on how we can support and reconnect these young people to school. And that's.
Thank you, Kayla. We
Yeah.
appreciate your presentation. And now we're going to have Tori present on Bay Area legal and
Great, thank you guys so much. I'm going to try to run through a few big topics quickly. So today I'm going to cover CalFresh, healthcare access, and helping unaccompanied homeless youth access their vital documents. So next slide. So this is just a little bit about our team at Bay Area Legal Aid. We cover all of the Bay Area counties pretty much. And our youth justice team has 5 attorneys. We specialize in working with youth who fall under one of these 3 categories primarily, which are youth experiencing homelessness, youth involved in the justice system or foster youth, and youth with disabilities. And we can really provide holistic legal services. So you can see here, we do pretty much any kind of civil legal service that our clients need, and we often can help with multiple areas in their life. Slide. So these are the big topics we're going to cover today. Next slide. We're going to start with CalFresh, which is also known as food stamps, or by the federal name, it's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Next slide. So CalFresh is a public benefits program that issues a monthly benefit. It is not a cash aid benefit, but it is a food benefit because it is limited on what it can be spent on. Benefits are issued on an EBT card, which looks like a debit card. It can be used just like a debit card at grocery stores, farmers markets, even online a lot of places now, especially since COVID. Amazon, Instacart, some of those places can now will now accept EBT card. And you can only use it to buy food or seeds and plants to grow food, which isn't a common one, but you can't use it to buy non-food items like household goods or medication or anything like that. Next slide. So to determine who is eligible for CalFresh, CalFresh looks at a household, not an individual. So a household isn't necessarily just who lives in one house or who lives at one address. There can be multiple households within one home, but a household is a group of people who live together and purchase and prepare their food together. They don't have to be related. Roommates could be a household for the purposes of CalFresh. But sometimes there are people who are required to be in a household together. So those would be spouses who live together. And importantly, for our purposes, children under 22 who do live with their parents are required to be in their CalFresh household. Now, people who are caring for children who are not their biological parents or adopted parents, legal parents, can put those children in their CalFresh household without being their legal guardians, as long as that child is part of that household that they regularly purchase and prepare food together. Next slide. So For unaccompanied homeless youth specifically, this is an area where counties are often confused about the rules themselves, and unaccompanied homeless youth face huge barriers in accessing CalFresh. So youth under 18 can receive CalFresh on their own. They can be their own household. If they are homeless and unaccompanied, they just need to meet these 5 criteria over on the side. So they need to be under 18. They need to not be living in the same home as their parents or guardian. They need to not be living with another adult who has parental control or authority over them. Now, this can be determined one of 4 ways. The first 3 are the least common: if that minor is married, in the armed forces, or legally emancipated. But the 4th one, which is the most common, is if that minor is financially independent. So they're supporting themselves. They're generally taking care of most of their needs. There's not another adult who's providing them with the majority of their financial support. The final 2 requirements are that they are purchasing and preparing food separately from others. So they're not a part of another household and eating the majority of their meals as a part of that household. And they're not in foster care. Foster youth are treated separately for the purposes of public benefits and CalFresh. But if unaccompanied youth meet these 5 criteria, so living away from parents and without another adult who has that parental control or authority over them, they can be eligible for CalFresh on their own as a household of 1. Youth are very often denied or told that they can't apply. I have had many social services workers just tell me like, oh, you can't apply for CalFresh if you're under 18. And if this happens to any student you are working with, please contact your local legal aid right away, because that's an improper denial. Next slide. This is just an updated table of the income limits to qualify for CalFresh and what the benefit provided looks like. So for a household of 1 right now, the maximum gross income to be eligible for CalFresh is about $2,200, and the maximum allotment is $281. During the pandemic, as long as there has been a public health emergency in effect, all households receiving CalFresh have been receiving the maximum allotment for their household size. So regardless of their actual income, if you are eligible for CalFresh, you are receiving whatever your maximum allotment is right now for your household size. So an unaccompanied homeless youth who's a household of 1 right now would be receiving $281 in CalFresh. This is set to change soon once the public health emergency is over, and benefits will be going down below that maximum allotment. Next slide. So to apply for CalFresh, 3 big ways that applications can be filed are in person at the county welfare department office, over the phone, or probably the easiest way is online. There's a very user-friendly website, getcalfresh.org. I believe it serves every county in California. It's quite user-friendly for youth to put in their application and upload any required verifications. So after the application is submitted to the county, there usually needs to be an interview. Right now, the change during COVID has been most of these interviews have been able to be taking place over the phone. So important to advise young people that after they put in their CalFresh application, they need to answer their phone at whatever phone number they put on that application, so that they can be available when the county calls them to verify that information. Finally, people who are applying for CalFresh have to submit verification if they have income and things like that, and their ID. But for homeless youth, a lot of times they don't have ID, or they aren't able to provide the verification that would normally be required. In those cases, collateral contacts can be used to provide that verification, which might be you as homeless liaison at the school district saying, I have access to the student's records, the student is who they say they are, here's something from the student's record that verifies that they are who they say they are, this is their date of birth, etc. And so if a young person's having difficulty providing required verifications, they can ask the CalFresh worker if they could provide a collateral contact instead. Next slide. So regular CalFresh applications need to be processed within 30 days, but for young people who have less than $150 in monthly income or less than $100 in liquid resources, which is money they have on hand to buy food with, like right now, they are eligible for expedited processing of their application, and it needs to be processed within 3 calendar days. Counties usually don't meet this timeline, but they are required to. Next slide. All right, Medi-Cal. This is California's version of Medicaid, free or low-cost healthcare for anyone, but especially children. As you'll see on this slide, Medi-Cal, eligibility for Medi-Cal is determined based on income. It's generally 138% of the poverty line, but for children, people under the age of 18, it's a much higher standard. So most young people are going to qualify for Medi-Cal. And importantly, eligibility for Medi-Cal in California is determined regardless of immigration status. So all youth, regardless of whatever type of status or lack of status they have, if they are under 26 in California, can be eligible for Medi-Cal. Along with Medi-Cal comes what is known as EPSDT, early periodic screening, diagnostic, and treatment. This is basically what says that youth are entitled to all of their preventative health screenings and anything that is medically necessary, including mental health services. So Medi-Cal is going to cover anything that they need medically. Next slide. I just wanted to point out quickly that California has also expanded this for youth who have Medi-Cal to include specialty mental health services. So specialty mental health services are a whole long list of things, but are basically mental health services that are kind of a step above just regular outpatient mental health services. And now in California, all youth under the age of 21 who have experienced homelessness are categorically eligible for these types of services. So sometimes these services look like an intensive care coordinator to coordinate a youth's team. They can look like a therapeutic behavior person, a mental health rehab specialist, really a whole menu of services depending on what's available in your county. I've linked to the BHIN, which is the state document that lays out eligibility for those services. And if a student is interested in accessing those, they can call Access or the mental health line in their county. Next slide. Very quickly, what medical services can minors consent to? Youth of any age can consent to medical care that's related to pregnancy, contraception, abortion, or sexual assault. And youth who are 12 or older can consent to medical care related to STIs, intimate partner violence, outpatient mental health services, drug or alcohol abuse treatment. Obviously, the law is this way, so we don't discourage youth from seeking treatment for any of these things. And for youth who are 15 and older and who are unaccompanied, they can consent to general medical care on their own. Next slide. How to apply for Medi-Cal. Generally, you can either apply online through mybenefitscalwin.org or over the phone to your local county. Next slide. Lastly, very quickly, vital documents. Birth certificates need to be obtained from the county where the child was born. Youth who are homelessness are entitled to a no-fee copy of their birth certificate. If youth don't have valid ID to obtain their birth certificate, generally 2 witnesses on a notarized statement can verify their identity. Next slide. Social Security cards, replacement cards can only be ordered online for adults who are over the age of 18. Youth who are under 18 must actually visit the Social Security office in person. to request their replacement card with their birth certificate and a form of photo ID. Next slide. A California ID card. Youth again must visit the DMV in person. They must present their social security number if they have one, a form of identity document like their birth certificate, passport, or some form of immigration document, as well as 2 residency documents. So these can be school records, pay stubs, or a letter from a shelter where they're staying. And again, homeless youth are eligible for no fee ID cards and can have a form signed by their McKinney-Vento liaison or school social worker to get that card for free. Next slide. All right, I think we're out of time to cover CalWORKs and these other programs, so we can go past these. And then here is the information to refer youth if you have youth in the Bay Area who are in need of legal aid. They can call our Youth Justice Hotline. For youth or families who are outside of those ages, they can call the General Legal Advice Line. And outside of the Bay Area, you can find your local legal aid at lawhelpca.org.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.